Chapter 11. Last Thursday, May 7th, I, my niece, and your 2 brothers went to walk in Plainpalais. Presently Ernest came and inquired if we had seen his brother. He said that he had been playing with him, that William had run away to hide himself, and that he vainly sought for him. "William!" Elizabeth shouted into the night. "Where are you?" By then an hour had passed since Ernest had appeared bearing William's abandoned Spencer in his arms. They'd searched the riverbanks, checked the woods, and walked the width of Plainpalais more times than she could recall. It had grown dark enough that both the Jures and Mont Blanc were indistinguishable save for stars winking above them. Thankfully, the storm Elizabeth witnessed to the south never passed their way. "He couldn't have gone far," Alphonse said. "He always did like to run off, didn't he?" Ernest set his arm around his father's frail shoulders. "We'll find him soon, father." "He probably went home," Elizabeth suggested, ignoring the panic roiling in her head. "It must be that. We'll find him there." "A child of 5? Alone?" Ernest said, incredulous. Elizabeth cradled her face in her hands. She imagined William's face submerged beneath the river, William gasping for breath. "Hush, you're alarming Elizabeth," Alphonse warned. "He knows his way." "You're right," Ernest said, his tone gentler. "Elizabeth, go home with father. Send a servant if you find William there. I'll remain in case he's still here." But William wasn't home when Elizabeth and Alphonse arrived. Sophie asked, "Shall I send servants to search Plainpalais? They're all in bed. I'll wake them." "Only the footman. No need to disturb everyone." Alphonse's face appeared leached of colour. "Bring torches from the carriage house. It's too dark to see otherwise." Elizabeth insisted. "I want to accompany you. My poor boy. No doubt he's lost and frightened. He's probably sleeping beside the river, cold and covered in dew." "I'll wake Justine," Sophie offered. "She'd know where he hides. She goes with him to Plainpalais every night." "Let her rest," Elizabeth replied, gathering her cloak. It had grown chilly now that it was night. "I'll need her tomorrow to take care of him after being up so late. Anyway, we've 6 people to search." Despite it nearing 10 of the clock, the gatekeeper let them out with a warning they'd be locked out of the city gates. "We've a boy missing," Alphonse explained. "It can't wait until morning." By then, a small gathering of people had joined the Frankensteins at the entry to Plainpalais. Soldiers, servants, and townspeople. Ernest ran ahead, showing where he'd already searched. How dark Plainpalais appeared to Elizabeth, how sinister. She'd never been there before at night. She sensed Ernest by her side. She could smell his scent, which was warm and soapy with an overlay of wine. His breath was heavy from running. "Stay close to me, Elizabeth. It won't do to have you go missing too. Come." From their vantage point, Elizabeth watched the torches spread out across the entirety of Plainpalais in all directions. The lights dashed in and out between trees and fields, swirling and moving like stars dancing in the heavens. If they hadn't been searching for a missing child, the torches would have been a sight to inspire wonder, not fear. Elizabeth understood the more those torches moved, the more unlikely it was they'd located William. Once they found him, all the torches would rush to one spot. Ernest said, "I pray he didn't fall into the river. I didn't dare suggest this to my father." "You told me this was unlikely." "Well, I've taken him fishing there, in the stream yonder." Ernest pointed with his torch. "We already looked there twice," Elizabeth assured, though her words didn't silence the rush of blood in her head. Something bad had happened, something evil. She felt it, she tasted it. Something to do with what she'd heard murmured in the marketplace and beyond. Someone had kidnapped William, someone who hated syndics and nobles. Perhaps someone from the Revolutionary Tribunal her uncle mentioned. There'd even been chatter about the arrival of a strange man scarred from war, who appeared as threatening as a monster. No one knew where he'd come from. She should have told Alphonse. She hadn't, for she hoped it was naught but a rumour. But Ernest knew of the chatter, didn't he? The thought wouldn't let Elizabeth go. It dug its claws into her like a bird of prey. "Ernest, you don't think—" This has nothing to do with the Revolutionary Tribunal." Ernest's jaw was set. "They'd never hurt William. Their anger is toward adults, not innocent children." A sharp inhale of breath. "Look!" In a field just beyond Plainpalais, the array of torches rearranged themselves into a brilliant constellation. The constellation tightened until it blazed like a sun. "They found him," Elizabeth breathed. All would be well. Ernest raced toward the constellation, abandoning Elizabeth to darkness. It took her some moments to catch up. Her stays were too tight for running easily. By the time she caught up with Ernest, her face had widened into a grin. "Ah," she sighed, "praise God!" There was William lying in the grass. He was sleeping, the poor child. How innocent he appeared, how sweet. His hair was ruffled, his hands clasped before his chest. He must have fallen asleep while saying prayers. He's safe. Yet everyone was weeping, even Alphonse. Elizabeth's heart pitched. Why weren't they smiling? They should be happy, shouldn't they? They'd found William. He'd come home with them, they'd give him a hot bath, some warm milk, and all would be well. Tomorrow they'd laugh over the fright he'd given them. "He's sleeping, that's all." "Elizabeth." Ernest shook his head. "Wake him," Elizabeth said, her eyes filling, her voice shrill. "Wake him! Why isn't anyone waking him?" Elizabeth barely recalled accompanying William's body back to the Frankensteins' home. Somehow they were in Plainpalais, and then they were home. Though Ernest laid William in the morning room away from her line of sight, some part of her did not believe William to be truly dead. He'd live again once they set him before a blazing fire after a warm bath. She'd chafe his limbs, restore breath into him. But all her hope fled once she beheld Alphonse's stricken countenance. He reached for Elizabeth. The tears on his unshaven cheek offered the confirmation she'd denied. Elizabeth struggled from Alphonse's arms. "Let me go to him." She next recalled Ernest trying to hold her back from the child she'd loved and nurtured since infancy, her dear Caroline's baby. Alphonse ordering, "Calm her." Sophie crying out, "Get Justine, she'll be able to help." But Justine was nowhere to be found. Elizabeth staggered into the morning room where William had been set. All was dark, for the candles remained unlit, shutters still closed, silent like a tomb. All she could hear was the rush of her breath, the beat of her heart. Once her eyes adjusted to the shadows, she made out a slight bundle on the settee. The bundle was wrapped in a yellow blanket, a blanket she recognized from William's bed. "Sweet Dormouse," she whispered, her throat clotted with tears. Outside, a bough of a tree snapped, shattering the silence. Or was it her heart cracking? Though Elizabeth understood the latter to be an impossibility, hadn't Victor, with his books and diagrams revealing the hidden workings of organs and veins and muscles, taught her otherwise? In that moment, it felt possible. She'd never be the same, couldn't be the same. As awful as Caroline's death had been, she'd lived a full life. William was but a child, an innocent, lovely child, who should still be alive with years before him. Elizabeth approached the settee, where that small bundle awaited. She pulled at the blanket, revealing William's sweet face. Surely God had taken his soul. He must be at peace. The blanket fell from his shoulders. His neck. Even in the shuttered light, she made out a chain of bruises around his tender throat, something she'd been unable to see when they'd found him in Plainpalais. Her eyes swam, knees swayed. Who could have done this to him? Why would they harm a child? The evil was incomprehensible. Unless... The locket, the one she'd given him, hadn't she last seen it about his neck? The ribbon holding it couldn't have snapped, could it? Perhaps he'd taken it off. Elizabeth tugged at his clothes, his pockets. Where was it? Gone. Someone had stolen it. She cried out, "Oh God, I have murdered my darling child!" The room buzzed with shadows and regret and sorrow and loss. The flesh of William's neck, the bruises livid and yellow and blue. And then it was Caroline she saw before her. Caroline before her death, a death that Elizabeth had only recently learned to accept as fate. Caroline cradling William as a baby, offering him to Elizabeth. "Promise you'll protect William. You love him as your own." She'd failed William just as she'd failed Caroline. Cursed. That's what I am. Elizabeth did not remember anything more until she awakened in her bed. The scent of sal volatile wafted in the air. Alphonse and Ernest were seated across the room, their heads bent toward one another. The windows were open. The sun appeared high, shimmering with brilliance. An afternoon sun. She must have been insensate for hours. The birds were singing as though life was as it had been before she'd accompanied William to Plainpalais the previous evening. A lush perfume mingled with the smelling salts. The lilac beneath her window had started to bloom. Church bells from St. Peter's rang in the distance. "We'll need to write Victor," Alphonse murmured to Ernest. "Surely he's strong enough to come home." Ernest agreed. "We should prepare him first." Alphonse cradled his head in his palms. "Ah, my poor Victor. What a homecoming he shall arrive to. What of the police? Have they any suspects yet?" Their conversation dropped to a halt as Elizabeth pulled herself up, head swimming. "Justine," she said, weeping. "I want Justine. Has anyone told her? She loved him too." "Justine is sick in bed," Alphonse said, his tone hollow. "She'd been out all night. She claims you granted her permission to visit her aunt in Chêne yesterday. Is this true?" "Yes, what of it?" Alphonse refused to answer. Elizabeth discovered why 2 mornings later, when the locket bearing Elizabeth's watercolour of Caroline was discovered inside the gown Justine had worn the day of the murder. "I suspected something peculiar about her absence that night," Alphonse said, his face grey. "To think I invited her into our home. Let her eat at our table, sleep under our roof." "Uncle, this cannot be. Justine loved William. I would have given the locket to her had she asked. There was no need for her to steal it. None at all." A sharp scream rang from downstairs. Justine, Elizabeth knew it. Elizabeth rushed from her room toward the stair landing. Downstairs by the portrait of Caroline, Justine stood in the center of the entryway surrounded by police. How small she appeared, so slight. She was still dressed in her white night-rail, her silvery hair unbound. The tresses dangled below her hips. One officer tried to grab her by her hair, another the hem of her night-rail. She appeared a will-o'-the-wisp, a pale spectre, as she slipped and flitted from their grasp. Elizabeth yelled over the balustrade, "Let her go! She's not a murderess!" She rushed downstairs, shouting all the while. But before she could reach Justine, Ernest pulled her back. As Elizabeth struggled to free herself, the two slipped as one to the floor. "No! No!" Justine circled from officer to officer until she dropped to her knees. The tallest officer used the opportunity to capture her wrists, which he yanked behind her. "I'm praying for the boy. Can't you see? Let me pray." Elizabeth banged her fists against the marble floor. "Justine!" Justine's head craned toward Elizabeth, her eyes white with terror, as the officers dragged her toward the door. Chapter 12. It was about 5 in the morning when I entered my father's house. I told the servants not to disturb the family and went into the library to attend their usual hour of rising. 6 years had elapsed, passed as a dream, but for one indelible trace, and I stood in the same place where I had last embraced my father before my departure for Ingolstadt. Victor returned from Ingolstadt within 3 weeks of Justine's arrest. Elizabeth was leaving the morning room after breakfast when she heard him emerge from the library. At first she didn't recognize Victor. He was so altered from when she'd encountered him in Ingolstadt. Instead of rushing to him as she should have, Elizabeth hung back. Victor's physical presence shocked her. He was thinner than she'd ever seen, his bones jutting where his flesh was exposed, his wrists, his jaw, his temples. His generous dark curls had been shorn close to his head, revealing the curve of his skull to her eyes for the first time. He'd been far more ill than Henry's letters had said. She recalled how, when she'd last encountered Victor, he'd been so agitated that he'd clutched her shoulders painfully tight. She later found bruises the hue of dying violets on her flesh. "Don't lie. You're not Elizabeth. You're my mother. Well, had been my mother. Go, back to the grave." "That's in the past," she whispered to herself. "He's better now." Still, she couldn't find it in herself to greet him. Not yet. She watched Ernest embrace Victor, watched the reunited brothers approach the life-sized portrait of Caroline in the entry hall. A small framed watercolor of William, the one Elizabeth had painted during their journey, lay on the mantel below the oil portrait. Victor cradled the watercolor of William in his palm. How he'd grown. He was a baby when I left. Would that I could behold him again. You come to us to share a misery that nothing can alleviate. Ernest's voice was shaky. Poor William. He was our darling and our pride. Even worse, the murderer has been discovered. The murderer discovered? Victor cried, color draining from his face. Good God! How can that be? Who could attempt to pursue him? It is impossible. One might as well try to overtake the winds or confine a mountain stream. I saw him too. He was free last night. I do not know what you mean, Ernest replied. But the discovery of the murderer completes our misery. It was Justine, his nursemaid. We've proof. The locket. Elizabeth's eyes filled. She still couldn't believe it. She'd had to hide her distress before her family to be the strong one, the stalwart one. Perfect. When alone, her panicked thoughts circled between how can William be dead and Justine couldn't have murdered him. I must save her. Alphonse had forbidden Elizabeth to advocate on Justine's behalf, warning the Revolutionary Tribunal would view this as undermining the scales of justice. We must trust in our courts, he urged. If she is innocent, she will be freed. Elizabeth must not have been as silent as she'd hoped, for Ernest called out in an aspect of alarm, Who's there? Only me. Elizabeth's stomach fluttered as she approached Victor. Victor, who appeared a stranger from the hale man who'd departed Geneva 6 years earlier. She drew a breath to steady the rise of her pulse. There was Victor. There was Ernest. Henry wasn't present. He must have gone home to his father. For the best, she told herself. Still, her treacherous heart sped at the thought of his proximity. I can't love Henry. I won't. She greeted Ernest, embraced Victor. Welcome home. How odd such words sounded after such a loss. Dearest Elizabeth, beloved friend. Victor grasped her hand bearing Caroline's emerald ring and pressed it against his lips. A warmth, a sorrow flickered within the depths of his gaze. His eyes were as welcoming as ever, the same deep brown pools with flecks of gold. I know Justine is innocent, he whispered as he bent to kiss her cheek. For a moment she felt a flare of hope. But at dinner any consolation Elizabeth had found in Victor's return fled. He ignored Alphonse's attempts at conversation, snapped at Ernest. Nor would he answer her when she addressed him. Alphonse mouthed, He's tired, that's all. Victor's behavior disturbed Elizabeth enough that she sought him in his room afterward. He was already in bed, the counterpane high over his chest. A candle on the mantel revealed his eyes were wide open. She knocked softly against the doorframe. May I come in? Victor blinked and sniffed. He'd been weeping. If you must, he said at last. She settled herself on the edge of his bed, like in old times when they were children, just as she'd tried to replicate that night in Lake Como with Henry. She lay next to Victor and grasped his hand. How cold his skin felt! She was tempted to stroke what remained of his hair, to feel it bristle beneath her palms, to orient herself to the Victor who'd returned to her. She didn't. She was too disquieted. After a moment, he said, "I know who the murderer is." "You do? We must tell the authorities." Victor broke her gaze. "I meant to say that the murderer cannot be poor, good Justine. It's impossible." A pause. "Why are you here?" "I thought we could comfort each other." She tried to push away her memories of Henry, how he'd felt beside her. Victor let out a huff. "Comfort? How can any comfort be found? My brother is dead, Justine in prison." He turned his back against her stomach. She embraced him. His spine felt a series of protrusions, a long snake-like cord. "You've grown so thin." Her voice dropped. "What made you so ill? Was it only overwork?" "I don't want to talk about it. I'd give anything to forget Ingolstadt. Elizabeth, I'm not the man I'd once been. I never will be. You should know that before we wed." "Nor am I the woman I was," she said, choking back emotion as she thought of William in his grave, Justine in her cell. "Loss will do that. We'll need to know each other anew." She closed her eyes, trying to invoke the Victor she remembered. The Victor who sat with her in summer gardens and brought her flowers and spoke of the wonders of nature. The Victor she'd loved from the moment she'd met him as a child. She kissed his shoulder, yearning for some show of warmth, something to reassure they were meant to marry as she'd promised Caroline, that they were fated, as Henry would say. She awaited his response, but all she sensed was agitation. His limbs shuddered before they turned rigid. His candle sputtered and blew out. He gestured wildly, moaning, "I can't bear the darkness," until she rose and lit another. When she returned to bed, he gave no thanks, only a sigh. The silence grew between them, somber and heavy. She laid a cautious hand against his forearm. She stroked the corded muscles, the long bones. He's like a cadaver. He even smelled strange, like rot. She pulled her hand away, settling it under his pillow. Something cold and metallic met her fingers. Her eyes widened as she drew out a pistol. Alphonse's from the library. Elizabeth recognized it. "Why are you sleeping with this? You're not going to harm yourself?" Her voice shook. "God, no. I haven't the courage for that." He grabbed the pistol back. "If you must know, after William—" He wanted to protect them. At last her affection ignited. She nearly wept with relief. He feared losing her, all of them. He truly didn't believe Justine murdered William. His strange outburst about knowing who murdered William wasn't only to appease her belief in Justine's innocence. However, the implications of Victor's claims were nearly as troubling. Who could have strangled her darling boy? Where could the murderer be? Did Victor really believe he'd strike again? He tucked the pistol back under his pillow. "You should go, Elizabeth. You deserve some sleep." He said nothing more, not even when she bid him good night. Yet she found she couldn't return to her room. Not yet. She was too unsettled. She made her way downstairs toward the library, past the entry where the portraits of Caroline and William remained on display. She nodded to Caroline in silent promise. A rise of voices from the kitchen caught her attention. The door was ajar, a lamp burning. She peeked through the door crack like a mouse. Ernest was seated at the long kitchen table with Sophie. Henry, too. Her eyes prickled at the sight of Henry, loyal, kind Henry who nursed Victor. Unlike Victor, Henry appeared much the same as when she'd last seen him, though his hair had grown long enough to dangle over his eyes. Every so often he brushed it back. The hour was so late. Had he come to the Frankensteins with the intent of avoiding her? "How is she?" Henry asked in a low voice. "I know it's forward of me to speak to you in confidence, but I believe you know Mademoiselle Elizabeth best." Elizabeth pressed her eye against the door crack, unable to turn away. Sophie set her chin against her hands. It's as you think, Monsieur Clerval. She blames herself for the boy's death.
I feared as much.
On top of that, well, I don't suppose you know what's occurred, Monsieur Clerval.
Sophie described the new revolutionary tribunal, the threats against the syndics, the fears they held for Alphonse.
They want to take power from the syndics, even if it means killing them. It's like what happened in France.
As she spoke, Ernest grew agitated. He chewed his lip, shook his head.
It's not that simple, he cut in, voice rising. The tribunal will insist on a new constitution for Geneva, one that is fair to all citizens. My father should help them.
Henry raised a hand to silence Ernest. Your father can sort his own troubles. It's Mademoiselle Elizabeth I'm concerned about. I can't bear to think of anything more befalling her. Madame Frankenstein's death affected her so. You both must protect her, care for her. Victor cannot. Victor is not as he was.
I know, Elizabeth thought, easing her way from the door.
Yet as she returned to her bed, it was only Henry she thought of. Henry who'd cared and protected her yet again. Suddenly she imagined Caroline's hand caressing her cheek, the weight of her guardian's emerald ring on her hand. It took another month before Justine's trial was brought to court, weeks during which 14 syndics were imprisoned for crimes against the state by the Revolutionary Tribunal. Thankfully, Alphonse was spared. Though he forbade Elizabeth from visiting Justine in prison, she secretly sent care packages of food and clothes accompanied by messages of support. During this period, Henry did not visit Elizabeth save for an awkward call to offer condolences for William's death. It's for the best, she told herself again. I should be thinking of Victor, not him. As for Victor, he remained peculiar. He'd taken to staying awake at all hours, staring out windows like a cat awaiting prey. Other days he refused to leave his room. Ernest brought Victor trays of food after promising he'd tasted everything first. Then there were days when Victor headed toward the lake, sailing for hours, even at night. The only one able to calm him was Alphonse, who was preternaturally patient with his eldest son. He's had a shock, he explained. He's been ill. The morning of Justine's trial, Elizabeth was dressed for court well before its scheduled start at 11 o'clock. We should arrive early to express our belief in her innocence, she told Victor. The jury will take note. Not that it mattered. By the time the Frankensteins had shown, the courtroom was already packed with more humanity than it was intended to hold. By then, the wheel of the year had shifted from June to July. It was a fetid July, too. The air lay especially heavy in the courtroom. Every so often, a matron snapped open a fan. From the chatter Elizabeth made out, everyone wanted to see the trial of the girl accused of murdering a child, far more scandalous than the imprisonment of a handful of syndics for resisting the March of Liberty. The voices in the courtroom swelled into a nearly indistinguishable rise of syllables and sentences. Can you believe the Frankensteins defend her? The girl is guilty as sin. Anyone can tell. The boy was an angel. She strangled him because of the revolution. No, because of the syndics. Monsieur Frankenstein is a syndic too, you know. She's the daughter of a gravedigger, an unnatural creature. What did they expect? They're wrong, Elizabeth whispered, clutching Victor's hand. Wrong. Do you see anyone outside? Victor whispered in turn, glancing around the courtroom toward the windows. Someone tall, dark? I don't know who you mean, Elizabeth replied, perspiration beading her brow. How warm the courtroom was. Was he going to start ranting again? From the sharp glint in his eye, she could tell the anxious Victor sat beside her, the Victor who paraded around the house at night checking for hidden enemies, rather than the melancholic Victor who went out in boats at all hours and only slept when drugged by laudanum and brandy. Alphonse and Ernest ignored him, lost in their whispered conversation. The judge is about to begin, a clerk announced. Silence! The chatter hushed as the judge called the court to order. A slender door opened to the left of the magistrate's bench, revealing the flash of a black bombazine skirt as its wearer limped into the courtroom. Elizabeth's hand tightened on Victor's. "She must be found innocent."
Alphonse said, "If she is, God forbid she should suffer as guilty." Justine's demeanor was serene, despite spending 2 months locked in a cell. She appeared prettier than usual, though this made little sense. Elizabeth prayed this would sway the jury's sentiments. Justine's colorless hair was plaited in swirls around her neatly shaped head. Her mourning gown, the cause for the black bombazine skirts, minimized the appearance of her hunchback. Elizabeth had brought her the outfit. Elizabeth, who wished there was more she could do to save her. Elizabeth lifted her hand in a tentative wave. A tear seemed to dim Justine's eye as she acknowledged the greeting with a small nod. Her chin jutted and quivered. "She didn't do it," Victor muttered. "A monster did."
"I know, Victor, I know."
A long shiver overtook Elizabeth as sweat dripped between her breasts. Who could have hurt William?
Evil exists no matter how we avoid it.
She felt as though she'd vomit. That conundrum of anger and guilt and sorrow she'd felt since Caroline's death flared anew. That sense of being cursed.
She couldn't have murdered my boy.
The trial droned on for hours. Elizabeth remained alert despite the stifling temperatures. Others dozed. Testimony revealed nothing Elizabeth had not known before. Justine had gone to visit her aunt in Shen, who'd been unwell. However, the aunt was unavailable for testimony. Justine claimed she'd abandoned Shen once she'd recovered. Justine did not know where her aunt had gone. Nor did any neighbors recall the aunt. Shortly before dawn, a market woman had spoken to Justine near Plain Palais, not far from where William's body was found. When the woman asked Justine why she was out so early, Justine had offered a peculiar reply. "Is it early? I hadn't noticed." Then she'd wandered away. It was at this stage Alphonse and Ernest were required to testify regarding the locket, which the Frankensteins had discovered in Justine's pocket. Elizabeth followed them. Again, no new evidence was revealed. Justine had gone to visit her aunt in Shen, who'd been unwell. Elizabeth had granted her leave. Elizabeth tried her best to restrain her emotion, to reveal the facts, but her voice quavered. She had expected Justine's aunt to testify on her behalf. She refused to consider what this might signify.
"I cannot bear to lose Justine as well as William."
Once the judge excused Elizabeth, Justine was called. Any serenity she'd exhibited at the start of her trial was gone. As she approached the bench, Victor hid his face in his hands.
"I sincerely trust all should be cleared by my honest description of the evening in question," Justine began in a faltering voice. "God knows how utterly innocent I am, and how much I esteemed William Frankenstein and his family, who have been my benefactors since I was a child."
She explained she had passed the evening of the murder at her aunt's house in Shen. On her return to Geneva at about 9 o'clock, she met a man who asked if she had seen the child who was lost.
"I had no idea the child was William Frankenstein."
She spent several hours helping look for him when the gates of Geneva were shut. As a result, she was forced to take shelter in a barn. She spent much of the night awake. Toward morning, she slept for a few minutes when someone's steps woke her from a nightmare. She found no one there. It was dawn when she quit the hayloft. That she had been bewildered when questioned by the market woman was not surprising, since she had passed a restless night. Concerning the locket found in her pocket, she could give no account.
"I know," Justine said, "how fatally my possession of the locket weighs against me. But I have no power of explaining it. Did the murderer place it there while I slept? If so, why should he have stolen the locket to part with it so soon? If I was a dishonest person, I'd think of a story to tell you to assert my innocence. But I am not."
Her voice broke.
"I must commit my cause to the justice of my judges. Yet I see no room for hope. I suppose nothing remains but to trust in God's mercy and the truth of my innocence. If the court will allow, I beg permission to have a few witnesses examined concerning my character."
Several witnesses were called, but they were unwilling to testify due to the foul nature of the crime. Justine's limp appeared especially robust as she returned to her seat.
She blinked repeatedly and sighed, hiding her face in her hands. Elizabeth yearned to rush to her, to protect her. I must save Justine. But how?
The judge said, "If there are no further witnesses—"
Elizabeth raised her hand. "I will speak."
"But you have already testified, Mademoiselle Lavenza. The jury is prepared to deliberate."
Elizabeth stood before the jury. How her heart pounded. "But I have not spoken to her character, sir. When I see an innocent creature about to perish, I must do what I can." A hush fell upon the court as Elizabeth returned to the magistrate's bench. Initially, her voice quavered with nerves. It grew in strength as she swore to Justine's loyalty, kindness, and goodness. She spoke of how Justine nursed Madame Moritz and Caroline during their final illnesses, that she had offered only affection to William and friendship to Elizabeth. For my own part, I do not hesitate to say that, notwithstanding all the evidence, I unequivocally believe in Mademoiselle Moritz's innocence, Elizabeth said. She had no temptation for such an action. As to the locket on which the proof rests, I would have willingly given it to her if she'd asked for it. So much do I esteem her. She is like family. At last, Elizabeth fell into silence, her heart still pounding. She searched the crowded court, seeking any sign of mercy toward Justine. To Elizabeth's horror, a low murmur of indignation grew until it took over the courtroom. Mademoiselle Lavenza is too good. What ingratitude to murder a child after caring for him. What did they expect? Look at her. She's a hunchback, a gravedigger's daughter. She must hang after this. As their voices swelled and rose, Victor pressed his hands over his ears, rocking in his seat like a madman. Elizabeth barely slept that night. At dawn the following morning, she discovered Alphonse wandering in the courtyard, still dressed in his nightcap and gown. For a moment she wondered if he'd been distressed by her testimony. But he kissed Elizabeth's cheek, calling her his angel, as he usually did. "Come inside, Uncle," she said, taking his arm. "You'll take ill." She recalled how regal he'd seemed when she first joined the Frankenstein family, like a king with Caroline his queen. Now, if she didn't know better, she'd think him befuddled. "But it's warm, Elizabeth." He offered a hand, revealing a bony wrist. "Look, no gooseflesh." "Someone might see you and think you unwell. Besides, it's going to rain." He frowned, looking down at his bare legs and feet. "You must think me mad." Elizabeth avoided his gaze. "I think no such thing." "Ah, you're a good liar as well as kind." He pursed his lips. "Unlike her, I cannot bear to say her name. No matter, it's been settled." He raised his arms toward the sky, toward the clouds. "At last there is some justice." Elizabeth's heart tripped. "Has there been word from the jury?" "Which one?" Alphonse asked. "The jury for the syndics? Or for her?" It took Elizabeth several more minutes to tease more words from Alphonse. He was too agitated. And a few more to force him inside the house. Then he collapsed onto a chair, shaking his head as the servants pretended not to notice his undressed state. "Tell me, Uncle, what of the jury?" She prayed her testimony hadn't turned them against Justine. "Very well, Elizabeth. Tomorrow, 11 of the imprisoned syndics are to be executed. Treason, or so they say. They'll shoot them in Plain Palais. Kinder than hanging, they claim." He shook his head. "There but for the grace of God, though I'm uncertain if there is any grace to be found these days." Elizabeth sank into the chair beside his. "What if they arrest you?" This was a possibility she'd refused to consider. "They won't. I resigned as syndic. This should satisfy the Revolutionary Tribunal. But Ernest would say that if I need to sacrifice my life for the sake of a new world, so be it." Alphonse began to sob like a child. "And if I am to be honest, I wouldn't mind. Perhaps I'd finally forget what she did to my boy.
I'll never forgive myself for bringing her back here." Elizabeth wrapped her arms around his frail shoulders.
"The jury hasn't decided, have they? She may yet be found innocent."
"Not anymore." He dabbed at his eyes. "The ballots have been thrown. They were all black. She's confessed. They'll hang her tomorrow at dawn." Chapter 13. Soon after, we heard that the poor victim had expressed a desire to see my cousin. My father wished her not to go, but said that he left it to her own judgment and feelings to decide. "Yes," said Elizabeth, "I will go, although she is guilty, and you, Victor, shall accompany me." She's confessed. It was this sentence Elizabeth recalled most as she fled Alphonse's side to confront Justine in prison. If she hadn't murdered William, why would she confess? It made no sense. Tiny doubts Elizabeth had ignored during the trial flared in her mind until she could think of nothing else. There'd been that slap Justine had given William that day, the locket found in her gown, her strange inability to produce her aunt as alibi. Soon Elizabeth was nearly to the city gate, which would lead down toward the prison. It lay not far from Plainpalais, where William's body had been found, and where Justine would hang once the sun rose. As Elizabeth ran, despair and anger mingled with shock, as though the cobblestones beneath her step had been turned to sand. "Elizabeth, wait!" Elizabeth turned. Victor, he'd followed. He pulled her against him. "Listen to me."
"Let me go, Victor. I need to see Justine, find out the truth. You can't understand how I feel, how I hold myself responsible."
"Elizabeth, I'm the one responsible. I know who the murderer is. The monster walks among us."
Victor again, with his talk of monsters and responsibility. "Then produce him. If not now, when?" She struggled from his arms. "Didn't you hear your father? She's confessed. She murdered William. How shall I ever believe in human goodness again?"
"I know she confessed a lie." Elizabeth snapped.
"Then tell me who the murderer is."
Victor's eyes grew large and dark in his ashen face. "I wish I could. I can't explain how or why I know this, but I do. I share your sorrow, but you can't understand my guilt. I know she's innocent. I know you don't believe her guilty."
"I didn't. But now that she's confessed—"
"I know you want to save her," he said, stroking her cheek. "Dear Elizabeth, beloved Elizabeth, Elizabeth my wife-to-be, believe my assurances. Justine is innocent." And now the old Victor was back, the one she'd adored as a child, the good Victor, the kind Victor, the Victor who wanted to save the world with science and chemistry and books. Not the Victor who slept with a pistol beneath his pillow or rocked like a madman in courtrooms. Sorrow and confusion churned within Elizabeth.
"I don't know what to believe,"
she cried at last. "But I do," he said, his tone ardent. "Let me accompany you. We'll visit Justine together." He caressed her cheek. "Beloved, you're trembling. Here, take my hand." With Victor by her side, Elizabeth entered the desolate, grey-stoned prison, avoiding the rows of family members awaiting the condemned syndics. A long stone hallway, lit by only a handful of candles, led to where Justine awaited. Her cell was dank, scented with urine and sweat, and scant of light. It could have been any season instead of summer. A relentless trickle of water pinged against the stones. Once Elizabeth's eyes adjusted to the gloom, she beheld Justine sitting on some straw beneath a small barred window, which revealed a narrow patch of leaden sky. Her hands were manacled, and her head rested on her knees. Justine slowly rose at Elizabeth's entry. It was then Elizabeth noticed her face was bruised, her lustrous silvery hair shorn beneath her stained linen cap. There was a hollow quality to her eyes. Haunted. "They've beaten her," Elizabeth whispered to Victor. She'd never heard of such punishment in Geneva, which prided itself on its civility.
But she'd also never heard of a woman condemned to die for the murder of a child. Justine's manacles trailed as she staggered in their direction. When she could go no further, she threw herself at Elizabeth's feet.
"You confessed," Elizabeth cried. "Why did you rob me of my last consolation? I relied on your innocence, and although I was wretched, I was not so miserable as I am now."
Justine looked up from the floor, steadily meeting Elizabeth's gaze.
"Do you also believe me so very wicked? I believed you guiltless until I heard you'd confessed." "I did confess," Justine admitted, "but I confessed a lie. I confessed that I might obtain absolution from my church. I confessed so they'd leave me alone. May God forgive me." "But how could you lie so?" Elizabeth accused, now weeping herself. "You guaranteed your death." "I had no choice. Ever since the trial ended, I was besieged by guards and my confessor, until I almost believed myself to be the monster they claimed. I confessed to a lie, and now I am truly miserable. But what else could I do?"
With this, Justine was overtaken by sobs of the most violent variety. As she wept, Elizabeth recalled Justine's devotion to her aunt, the many kindnesses she'd offered the Frankensteins over the years, her love of William. Any lingering doubts fled. She couldn't have murdered him. She offered Justine her hand.
"Forgive me for having distrusted you, my friend. There must be something I can do. You perish on the scaffold? This cannot be."
She thought of impossible schemes that could never be. She imagined forging a letter to gain Justine's freedom. She imagined spiriting Justine to freedom. She imagined a miracle.
"I would do anything to free you."
Justine wiped her eyes, calmer now.
"No one can free me. I do not fear to die, for that pang is past. God gives me courage to endure."
And to Elizabeth's surprise, she believed Justine truly meant this. She understood she couldn't escape death, and now only yearned for closure in this world. Victor must have made some sound from his corner, for Justine acknowledged him.
"You are very kind to visit. I hope you do not believe me guilty."
Victor hung his shoulders, twisting his hands. Elizabeth responded for him.
"Victor is more convinced of your innocence than I was. Even when he heard you had confessed, he did not credit it."
Justine offered a wan smile.
"I truly thank him. In these last moments, I feel the sincerest gratitude towards those who think of me with kindness."
A bald, stout guard approached. "It's time." Elizabeth cried to Justine,
"I cannot bear to leave you." "You must."
Justine embraced Elizabeth.
"Farewell, Elizabeth, my only friend. May heaven bless and preserve you. May this be the last misfortune you ever suffer. Live and be happy, and make others so."
Elizabeth's last sight of Justine was her face, stricken, pale, resolved. The guard led Elizabeth and Victor outside the prison, where they were confronted by a sky that appeared more ominous than it had been upon their arrival. Elizabeth made out a faint hammering from the direction of Plainpalais. Justine's scaffold. They were building it. Victor appeared not to notice. "It's going to rain any minute. I'll get a carriage. Stay here beneath the eaves where it's dry." But Elizabeth couldn't let him leave her. Not yet.
"How can we go on knowing such evil exists? Knowing she'll die tomorrow?"
Victor kissed her brow, his lips cold. He murmured soft sounds, promises of better days. They offered scant comfort. Her tears released like a cloudburst. Yet as she wept, she recalled the families of the 11 syndics also to be murdered. How small her sorrows must be in their wake.
"I know this is selfish of me, but I want my Justine."
Victor stroked her hair. "There's one thing we can do for Justine. One thing to bring her peace." Elizabeth looked up from his sleeve, which had grown wet with her tears.
"What would that be?"
He said with a disaffected air,
We can offer her the honor of burial beside my mother and William." She drew away. "Your father will never allow this." Victor's eyes burned bright. "Elizabeth, she must be buried there. Otherwise her body will be abandoned in a pauper's grave. Someone will steal it." Elizabeth's heart stuttered. "How would you know of this?" He waved his arms. Because I've heard talk of this. They'll desecrate her body, crack open her ribs to remove her organs, harvest her bones, peel her flesh, study her hunchback." She felt sick to her stomach. Who could commit such horrors? Medical students, chemists, natural philosophers? They call themselves resurrectionists. Elizabeth could listen no more. She fled, abandoning Victor outside the prison. But she didn't return home. "Elizabeth? What are you doing here?" Henry exclaimed when she arrived at the door of the Clerval's shop. He was in the process of unlocking the gate for the afternoon. A soft plunk of rain hit her forehead. Another. She didn't answer, couldn't answer. She only knew she needed him. No matter. Henry didn't press, only led her inside once he'd opened the shop door. "This is unexpected," he said, running his fingers through his unruly light brown hair. "Tea?" "No, thank you." She stood in the middle of the black and white tiled floor, her hands dangling with uselessness as she took in the overstuffed shop. The books, the taxidermy owl, the printing press in the back of the long room, the displays of sextants and loops and telescopes in their low glass cases, the bookshelves. How long had it been since she'd last visited the Clerval's shop? A year? More, before they'd left for Lake Como, before Ingolstadt. "I love you. I always have." Suddenly she recalled Henry lying beside her in that shadowed, curtained bed in Lake Como. How empty her soul felt when she'd awakened to find him gone. "I must not think of this." "I suspect you're here because of Justine," Henry said after an awkward moment. "I heard what happened." "They're going to hang her. Murder her, really. I cannot bear it. On top of that, Victor wants to bury her in the family tomb. He ranted that if he didn't, her body would be buried in a mass grave or it would be desecrated by... Oh, I can't say." Henry didn't rush to comfort her as he once might have. He avoided her stare as he set a stack of books inside a locked cabinet. Elizabeth pressed, "You can't believe she's guilty. You saw how kind she was to William, how devoted to my aunt." He finally met her eyes. "Elizabeth, I don't know what to think. She's been convicted. She confessed a lie to win absolution from a papist priest, nothing more." He gathered another pile of books. Rousseau, Milton, Wollstonecraft. He was dismissing her. "Henry, how can you be so unfeeling? Of everyone I know, I thought you'd be sympathetic to her cause." Unlike Victor, who's mad, Victor, who rants about monsters. But she couldn't think of Victor, not now. Her anger toward Henry felt a gift, a distraction. She welcomed it. He set the books down, his mouth tight. "I am sympathetic. But in retrospect, I will admit there was something about Justine I found disturbing. A watchfulness, an eagerness. She was a good servant, a true friend to me. But there was also the way she worshipped your aunt. The hair, the accent, it seemed unnatural. That's because my aunt was kind to her. She admired her. It wasn't only that. Justine's mother. It was peculiar she never visited Justine, that she'd hated her so much. Oh, I know Madame Moritz later tried to make amends. Still, what sort of mother does this without good cause? Perhaps there was something she knew that we didn't." Elizabeth's mouth tightened, recalling Maria. "There are truths you don't know about the world. Truths you are fortunate to never experienced." An unfair accusation, since he had no mother, but he'd forced her. Henry didn't flinch, nor did he back down. "I question, that's all. But now, with William gone..." Elizabeth turned toward the door. "I should go home. Forgive me for disturbing you." He flinched at her sarcasm. "No, don't leave, Beata. Not like this. I'm sorry." He reached for her wrist. "Please don't leave. I'm begging you. I'm sorry to have been combative. Anyway, it's starting to rain. I was mistaken to come here." In all the years they'd known each other, they'd never argued, not like this. It was awful. Troubling. She felt worse than ever. Henry was usually the calm one, the considered one. If he didn't believe in Justine's innocence, what hope was there? "No, I'm glad you came. I missed you, Beata. More than I can say. Again, I'm sorry. I lacked compassion." And then he fell to his knees before her like a knight of old, as he had during that last dinner in Lake Como. "Tell me the truth. I'm begging you, Beata. Tell me now, and I'll never ask you again. Are we arguing over Justine, or because of what happened that night when I confessed I loved you? To punish me for esteeming you above all other women?" Her head grew light, her heart full. He loved her. A year had passed since that night in Lake Como. Not once had he mentioned it, not even when she'd come to Ingolstadt and he'd sent her away. She'd done her best to convince herself she'd imagined his confession of love. She hadn't. A mixture of joy and sorrow churned within her. It felt a physical pain, a twisting. He loved her, but they could never be. She choked out, "Henry, I don't know how to respond." "Well, I do. I do love you beyond all others. I love you more than I ever thought I could love anything, even heaven itself, God forgive me. I love you enough to betray my best friend in the entire world and his family. And even though you don't love me in return, I'll love you until my last breath." There, he'd said it. There felt a finality to his words, an inevitability. Once he'd finished speaking, he remained on his knees before her, eyes wide as though he'd shocked himself as much as he'd shocked her. She took him in, this man she'd known for so many years, as though he was new and she was old, that all of her life had passed and she was examining her regrets, her joys. That night in Lake Como, when they'd lain together as though they were the only man and woman in the world. Her confession of her darkest secrets, to which he'd responded with more compassion than she'd shown herself. Those hours they'd shared stories and art, while Victor expounded about science and philosophy. King Arthur, Paradise Lost, Agrippa, Paracelsus. Looking back, she realized they weren't an enchanted circle of three. Even in Ingolstadt, they'd been 2 against 1. Elizabeth and Henry, not Elizabeth and Victor. And then she realized, vow to Caroline or no, she couldn't be Victor's wife. She wanted Henry. She'd been a fool to deny the truth. Even if she did marry Victor, that night she'd shared with Henry doomed any happiness she might have found with Victor. She'd always wonder what might have been. Most of all, she couldn't marry Victor because she loved Henry. This hadn't changed since Lake Como. She'd only yearned to forget in the same way one would yearn to forget a sorrow too great to bear. For all of Henry's talk of fate, it hadn't mattered. "I'm sorry," Henry said, struggling to his feet. "I can tell I've upset you. I apologize. I shouldn't have said what I did. I was wrong. Please forgive me. Don't tell Victor. I know your heart has been joined to his since you were a child. I've been so disloyal." Before she could reconsider, she raised herself on her toes and angled her mouth toward his. And then she was in his arms, and he in hers. Her throat released a low moan, a softening. His arms tightened about her. He bent to kiss the tears from her eyes, and then his lips were on hers, and their mouths opened as though they'd merge souls if they could. This time when they kissed, he tasted of coffee and regret, of past choices not taken. But things could be different, couldn't they? Too late, her mind answered. Well, if it's too late, then let us have this day, this one time, and never again. Once they'd broken away, she said, I love you too. Caroline, forgive me. He reached for her with a long sigh. He kissed her again. A pause in their kiss to break away and lock the shop door. When he returned, he pulled her against him anew. She felt her bones grow soft, her body fluid, electric. Victor, forgive me. Another kiss, this one more demanding as he led her toward the back of the shop. toward the stairs that led up to the rooms he shared with his father. "Is your father at home?" she murmured, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Away. Montreux. Business. He'll be home later in the week." "Servants?" "Off today." "We're alone." "Yes, alone." And then they were upstairs in his sitting room, side by side on his soft blue chaise with its piles of books and papers surrounding it like a pathway to wisdom. She'd rarely been inside his residence. Usually Henry came to the Frankensteins, not the Frankensteins to Henry. She snuck a glance about the room. A tall fireplace bound in creamy marble flanked by even taller bookshelves, wide windows looking out onto the cobblestones of the Place du Bourg de Fort. A half-closed pair of green-painted double doors she suspected led to his bedroom, a cup of half-drunk tea beside a chipped plate filled with abandoned toast crusts. Her gaze returned to her hands, which Henry still held. He stroked her palm with his fingertips, as though awaiting her permission. She reached for him, her mind silencing at last. They did nothing that would leave Elizabeth changed from when she'd arrived at his door. She'd go to her wedding night innocent of the act that joined men and women as one. But Henry demonstrated his devotion in ways she'd never anticipated. She soon found herself lying against the chaise in her chemise, flesh bared, arms wrapped about his lean torso, his hands stroking the inside of her thighs until she thought she'd faint with longing. She pulled his body against hers, nudging him toward places she'd been told should remain untouched before wedlock. "I love you more than you can imagine," he whispered, his breath warm against the length of her neck before he captured her mouth in a kiss. "I desire you more than I thought possible. But we shouldn't." Another kiss, one that lasted longer than she believed possible. "I know, Henry. But what if we—" "Yes." Yes. She shut her eyes. Lips upon breasts, tongue against teeth, desire and acceptance, pleasure that made her gasp with surprise, delight. And then, when it was over, she returned to her body with a shudder. "I'm alive," she thought, filled with wonder. "I live." But that wasn't the end of it. Once Henry stirred from her arms, he reached for a journal that laid on a side table, the one with the forgotten tea and toast. He offered a stub of a pencil just as the rain began in earnest. She inhaled the clean scent of wet leaves and clean air, the ping of water in a pot set under a roof leak. "Draw me?" he asked, turning to a blank page. "I want to see the sort of art you make for yourself when you're alone." "Please?" And so she did, taking care to avoid any details that would reveal his identity to any who might discover the sketch. The curve of his buttocks, the dimple at the base of his spine, the soft forest of hair along his chest, his cupped hand against her breast. Once she finished, she offered Henry her sketch. As he examined it, his face shifted into an expression she could not decipher. Was he disturbed? Would he tell her to destroy it, find it vulgar? A smile returned to his face. She let out a breath. "It's beautiful, Beata. Like you. I'll treasure it forever, for it'll always remind me of this day." He reached for her. The journal fell from his hands. She'd always lived in her emotions, her obedience. But her body, how powerful it was, to know such pleasure, to understand that her body was capable of feeling this, of even creating life from it. And then it all came back. Justine's body. Soon she would be dead, hanged in Plainpalais. How could she have given way to love when Justine was suffering? When Henry believed her possibly guilty? "Ah, Justine, forgive me. How I wish I could save you." Henry must have sensed her melancholy, for he asked, "What can I do to soothe your spirit?" "Do you still believe in fate?" she asked. He stroked her hair. She turned away. He did not press. Hours later, Elizabeth woke to a sunrise so bright that the sky appeared drenched in scarlet. She was alone in a bed. Henry's bed. When had they ended up there? She vaguely recalled him leading her there in the middle of the night. Or had she led him? She should have gone home hours earlier.
She hadn't. She couldn't bear to. Yet nothing had happened between her and Henry. Well, not really. On her wedding night, Victor would never suspect. But I can't marry Victor. Not after this. Her heart gave a skip. Victor, she'd run off from him. Was he worrying? What of Alphonse? She should have at least sent a note. She pulled herself up against Henry's pillow. The lime-washed bedroom was small, dark, with only a small window looking out onto an alley. Velvet bed curtains the color of sunlit amber, fringed in silk. She drew the curtains open. No sign of Henry. Perhaps he was asleep on the chaise in the sitting room. Perhaps he'd gone down to his shop. Instead of missing him, she was grateful for the solitude. She needed time to think, to decide what to do. A young woman was to be hanged, a young woman who'd confessed to a lie. A child had been murdered, a child who should be alive and sleeping in his bed. The Frankenstein family would never be the same. Nor would she and Victor. Victor was mad. She loved Henry. Henry loved her. Elizabeth knew this as much as she knew the sway of Henry's spine while she'd drawn him. Then reason returned. What about her deathbed promise to Caroline? How could she humiliate the Frankensteins who loved her as their own? She'd break Alphonse's heart, leave him without hope. Strange she didn't consider Victor's. Yet the peace she felt being with Henry, had she ever felt such before? The bedroom door opened. Henry. He appeared freshly shaved and dressed, though his eyes were rimmed with shadows. Had he even slept? "I've just returned from the Frankensteins," he said, offering her a cup of tea. He settled on the edge of the bed beside her. "I received a note from Victor in the middle of the night. No one knew where you'd gone, so I went and made some excuse you'd taken ill while visiting me, which your uncle accepted without a peep. To be honest, he appears more upset about the syndics." It wasn't Alphonse Elizabeth was thinking of. Victor? He was also awake. I suspect no one there got any rest last night. And yes, he mentioned Justine's burial when your uncle was distracted. He stroked her cheek, gazing into her eyes. I don't believe Victor's ill again, only distressed, as we all are. However, I do think there's wisdom to his proposal about Justine's grave. His brow knit. When I was in Ingolstadt, I noticed practices that were disturbing. I shan't speak of them, but Victor is right. We should intervene to protect Justine. She shivered despite the warmth of the tea in her hand. What had Victor called these grave robbers? Resurrectionists. They'll desecrate her body, crack open her ribs to remove her organs, harvest her bones, peel her flesh. Elizabeth's stomach churned as she thought of poor Justine violated, disassembled. My uncle will never allow her to be interred beside William. I know, but I've a plan. The plan Henry laid out was simple. He'd accompany Justine's corpse to the Villa Lavenza and bury it in the small cemetery that hosted the graves of Elizabeth's mother and father. He'd arrange for a service in her faith to bring her soul peace. His father would need to understand his absence. He rose from the bed, taking her emptied teacup. It's nearly dawn. I'll arrange the carriage for Justine's transport. I'll write you when all is settled. Until then, adieu, Beata. Her heart skipped a beat. Was this really farewell? Was he really leaving thus, without any word of the future? None of the past? She grabbed his forearm. Take me with you, Henry. He met her eyes. You don't mean that. I do. You understand people will gossip. Worse. I don't care. I love you. I love you too, but what of Victor, your uncle? She pressed her lips against his, which provided all the answer he required. Once they'd parted, breathless and dizzy, he beamed a broad smile. We'll go to Italy together. We'll protect Justine. And then, if you'll have me, we'll wed. He sank to the bed beside her. He kissed her more times than she could count, some of these light and feathery, others deep and soulful. In between these kisses, she'd tell him the truth about her sorrowful past, or as much as one could in such scant time.
She'd confessed the deathbed promise she'd made to Caroline to wed Victor, and that while she'd loved Victor then, she didn't love him now, not like that. She'd tell Henry everything, even about Maria. He'd understand, help her find forgiveness. In time, they'd find a way to make amends to the Frankensteins, to Victor, to show gratitude while honoring their hearts. After all, Elizabeth couldn't imagine Caroline wanting her to wed Victor if she loved someone else, vow or no. She'd no longer allow herself to feel cursed. But now there was only Henry's beloved face before hers, and his unanswered proposal. "Yes, we'll wed," she said, embracing him with the full of her body. "Yes."